So let's talk briefly about this literature review and all our endeavors, because in somebody's head it's sometimes difficult to distinguish between things that you have read in a paper and somebody told you and so on. So did we learn something useful at all? So that is the general topic I want to talk. And I'll start with contentious issue about myths and monsters. And this is a quote. And this is very well-known quote attributed to a guy called Dan Ariely from Duke University. And the missing bit, in fact, is a thing called big data. But the same kind of big data is like teenage sex kind of quote can be applied to many, many other things. And fintech is one of them. It's a very fashionable thing. Everybody talks about it. Everybody has an opinion. Similarly, as everybody in this country has an opinion about football and maybe about cricket in India. I don't know. And there are a lot of kind of contradictory opinions. Everybody pushes their agenda, and it becomes a big mess, a very big mess in which is very difficult to distinguish the weeds from the actual seeds. And what do these issues and problems relate to? Well, they relate to several different kinds of areas. First of all, definitions. I personally don't care that much. It's not inconsequential because you need to know what you're talking about, and a lot of the controversies and misunderstanding kind of derive from the fact that people call different things by attaching the same levels and so on. But people sometimes can go in too much detail of trying to define finely and granularly something. And the issue with the fintech is, well, it's an evolving kind of area, and whatever effort we put into it, we will never ever be able to kind of finely define it and so on. So you need to apply some common sense into this. But there are a lot of controversies, things where people take a black and white view and say this is better than that and so on. And when you start kind of digging into what they actually mean, you can discover that most of these controversies simply don't exist. And the issue is that quite often things change. Whatever was can become exactly the opposite. And there are issues about the motivation. So to give you an example about motivation, we talked about this. We assume that most of the, say in the UK, most of the motivation of financial services is based, not all of it, is based essentially on convenience. It's easier to do something and so on, while in India it's mostly based on cost cutting, with obviously exceptions and so on. But when you dig deeper into this, you will find that for the same kind of service, either the motivation can shift from one to the other, or they may state this is based on a lower cost and so on, while in fact it could be based on quite a lot of elements of convenience. So these kind of things are more gray than they appear to be. And there are always the issues based on this kind of nuanced views and so on about recommendations, which is better, how to proceed and so on. So I'll get and I will classify all these takeaways, not the unhealthy type obviously, into several kind of different pots, to put it. The issues about the financial ecosystem, regulatory framework, the way fintech evolves, grows, develops, and so on. And obviously, we need to say something about the trade issue, because a trade facilitation is one of the kind of objectives and aims of this particular kind of project. So, and I will talk about this in very, very briefly. So why financial ecosystem is very, very widely referred in the literature. Virtually everybody has something to say about it, and it's considered to be quite important. And the reason it's important, it is the environment in which everything can grow, can develop, or die eventually. So, and the nature of the financial ecosystem, which is the environment with all its supporting and prevention mechanisms, it defines how anything, including fintech, can develop. It defines the path. Where can you go? Because it includes both all the constraints that because certain things are not available, cannot be done, and the opportunities because of all the support mechanisms, the linkages and so on that the financial ecosystem essentially provides. And yet, on top of that, if you try to look deeply into this, it's very difficult to describe. Now, there are a few papers that say these are the characteristics of what financial ecosystem should look like. The ideal one. There are a few that describe specific countries and bring a few of the like bullet points of the ecosystem that is characterized there and so on. But mostly the financial ecosystem is derived from the outcomes. So essentially, what you can do is the difference in how the fintech develops, evolves, and so on can be attributed, can be related to the difference in the ecosystems between the different countries. So to give you an example here, we know, for example, that India is very big in fintech in terms of payment system with the unified payment interface and so on. While the UK is much more prevalent in terms of like neo-banking, investment services, all these investment platforms and so on. Now, why? You can ask, why is this the case? Well, the case is because of the large kind of underserved population in India and so on. Policy and business and so on have put a lot of efforts into more basic kind of services, into things that rationalize these services, decrease costs and so on. And payments frameworks are things that naturally kind of lead to this rationalization. And therefore, this is where the whole thing kind of develops. And the reason why it is here is because there is a lot of policy involvement in this. There is a need for it. So there is a sufficiently large market and so on. And essentially, the way the businesses, the support services, the financial institutions, operations, and so on evolved in India provides an environment that supports this particular kind of services. While in the UK, the issue has been UK is one of the countries with the most competitive banking sector. So go in Europe and you will see you will be charged for all kinds of things, withdrawing your money from the cash machine and so on. It's very similar in America. Here you can apply for mortgage, you can go to anyone, even building society based, I don't know, somewhere in Snowdonia, if such exists. It doesn't, but it's very, very kind of competitive.
Sorry, Philip, can I just jump in here? Yeah. I thought we were doing a meta-analysis of the literature, like the total number of papers we've reviewed, what the various categories. Are we getting there?
This is the thing I greatly, total number of papers, waste of time.
Have we surveyed 100 papers? I mean, I don't know. We haven't surveyed.
I will argue that all the papers that have fintech, 99% of them are totally irrelevant for our purposes. So just saying how many papers there are, what? You can never say how many papers there are. It depends how you count
exactly them. I mean, so what, have we reviewed anything at all? I mean, what have we done?
What I'm talking about the themes and the topics that what the literature essentially says.
Yeah, so do we have, do you remember we started with a literature review, one meta-analysis paper that I think Thangam gave us. I thought we were trying to progress down that sort of framework to do the literature review in a systematic way.
What the literature says, not how many papers there are in the literature. I don't care whether there are 5 or 500 or 5,000.
No, but have we reviewed any of them? Have we actually looked into them? Have we, or how are we going about it?
We have a database. Now, we can describe the whole process, the protocol. You do the Google search with 3 separate kind of searches. Take the top 100 papers in this, which is the first 10 pages that come. You trace backward and forward kind of references, the relevant ones. Therefore, you decide, is this useful or not? If it's not useful, throw it out. If it's useful, you trace backward and forward references, one level only, and then you basically go through them and decide this one goes into the bin, this one we add to the database, and this is essentially the process.
So do we have this protocol then?
Yeah, we have it.
A software-based protocol, is it?
It's not software-based protocol. It's the protocol of what you do. It's like 1, 2, 3. And the protocol is, it's written somewhere, but essentially you do a Google Scholar search, good reasons why this and not other database, with essentially we have the general fintech kind of thing, where in India and UK, technically they're fintech India, fintech UK with some other extra words, because if you have fintech, it finds the general stuff anyway. Then you have fintech and the search about the fintech and trade and services. So out of these 3, you take the first 10 pages of results, you look at it, paper, you add it or reject it, and then for each of the added one, you trace back and forward. Now, the issue is the forward one is slightly easier. Always for the backwards one, you may need to change the database, because essentially what Google search does, it's essentially finds the paper in 5 or 6 places, and in some of the databases, basically you have to manually search this, or some of the others that you're provided with the links. So you go through the appropriate one and you click on the relevant ones, and quite straightforward.
No, but remember, we've been collecting a lot of white papers from Deloitte, from all sorts of other places. Are they all in one place? I mean, I'm struggling to understand how this is going to feed into our research, right? We have a lot of white papers, then we have a lot of referee journal articles, then of course we have to categorize into empirical or regulatory or whatever. So where is, don't we need to be
they're all in the database. Essentially, anybody can add anything to the database. Plus, at the end, you will always have an ad hoc kind of additions to it, simply because the whole thing changes and so on. And you cannot repeat the process every.
So have we been putting papers into Zotero? I wasn't aware of that, because I hadn't been doing anything like that. So is somebody doing that?
Yeah, we did this end of last year, essentially, and since then, I added a few since then for different kind of reasons, but anybody can do it. But my understanding was that, and I made it available to anybody, so that anybody can go and add. And the important thing there is that it's not that simply you provide a list of papers. Providing a list of papers, I can create a list of papers for half an hour with thousands of papers. It's useless. The useful thing is that you go and into the notes, basically put a note, what it is, what is the important that this paper says, and so on. And then at a later stage, when you do anything, you can go through the notes, and you can have 5 people putting notes if necessary, as the separate notes, obviously. And then you can review what the ideas in the papers are. Because let's be fair, literature review is not what 99% of the people say. I hate doing literature review, but it's not shopping list, because A said this, B said this. Useless, waste of time. It's a review of ideas. What is the idea that somebody is claiming, and so on, and how does it relate to practical relevance, to other ideas, and so on? How does it fit into the bigger kind of picture?
I think, Philip, my understanding is we actually requested everybody to update the materials to Zotero. and some people have done, we also got some lapses in between. But whatever in the Zotero there, I think Philip used. But in addition, Philip, you have also done a Google review to look into some of the materials. That's what I read. He prepared a protocol for the collection of the data.
Yeah. The protocol essentially reviews to how do you do the literature search review, because otherwise you look here and there. So it's systematic in a way that avoids the arbitrariness.
What I'm struggling to understand is, can you tell us 10, do we at least have 10 papers that are critical to our research or something like that? We say that there are thousands of papers being written on this field. I'm struggling to even find 10.
Essentially, I have written a small document about the things that I'm talking about today and all these ideas. And normally, because it's straightforward, after all, it's referencing system, you put the reference to each of these statements, saying who claimed whatever they claimed, whether it makes sense.
For instance, Philip, if I have to tell Alex, okay, here is the literature review that Philip has got for us about let's say sandboxes or regulatory framework. Can we go somewhere that will provide us for? Alex have to now find it by himself.
No, he doesn't need. So essentially, he can look at the actual database. I can click on any of them and see what the notes are. He can, if he decides, add another note, which is basically a brief description of saying what he thinks this particular thing says. It's useful to keep them in separate rather than modifying existing ones. And this is what it is essentially. It's a list of papers which each of them associated with different things, bibliographic details, notes of what actually they say. Some of them have their own
just out of interest, I don't know if Alex and Gukaran need to have access to the Zotero thing. That we can quickly have a look at that.
Anybody can give them access. I can do it if you don't know how to, but you see, everybody has the right, as a system is set, to be administrating it, to invite people and so on.
And also, Alexander, if you find some materials, you can also add it. That's why I said in the beginning, it's a very organic process. We need to continually updating it. And then, as Sherry said, we got so many reports going through around our emails and like that.
Yeah, they have not been uploaded, updated. Because I haven't been doing it.
Yeah, so many documents in the email. So I think it's our I think.
Let me go on with the substantial kind of thing.
Sorry, just a second. I haven't gotten access to Zotero yet. I don't know what.
I will send you an invite when we finish. It should be quite straightforward.
And to Gukaran, please.
Yeah. No problem. I can get your emails, these current ones from the meeting thing, and I can because actually sending an invite basically means writing down on the system what your emails are, and the system will invite you. All right, no problem. And then the issue with the financial ecosystem is this is the big issue with fintech in general. There are feedbacks. So when something new arises, it essentially changes the ecosystem. You have a new kind of payment system or a new financial service that is digitalized and so on, then the whole ecosystem, the way it operates, changes drastically. And this is the issue that the feedbacks create most of the problems with the interpretation that many of the papers in the literature provide. Because let's be fair, most of the people who write papers take the ceteris paribus kind of view. Things are fixed, and this is how this affects everything when everything else is fixed and doesn't change. But the problem is that when you introduce something, the disrupting role of fintech, as if you like it, and so on, the whole system essentially changes. And this creates quite a lot of tensions and problems, and many of the statements that you can find in the literature have to be taken with a big bag of salt, to put it another way. So, and what about the regulation? Now, regulation in a way is part of the financial ecosystem, to be fair, because it's something that is there available. But fintech presents a very kind of unique changes, kind of challenge to regulation in general. And the challenge that it presents to regulation is like, I'll call it two-edged sword. So first of all, it's very, very often claimed that financial service, fintech disrupts the industry, changes the way things are done. And if you present a major kind of disruption, the issue obviously is that certain things will stop working. Loopholes in the legislation will arise. Things that when the regulation and the legislation was introduced, nobody imagined to think about this, so it can create new threats, and these loopholes have to be closed as soon as possible. The other kind of issue, obviously, is that some of the things, some of the beneficial impacts of these new technologies and so on may be prevented from happening altogether if they're subject to regulation that doesn't allow them to do certain things. So essentially, the regulation has to do this balancing kind of act to facilitate beneficial outcomes and stop detrimental ones and so on. And essentially, the whole kind of problem with this is that the regulation needs to kind of be quite dynamic, because these things change. And the reason they change is, as I mentioned, is that evolving fintech changes the industry, changes the environment, changes everything and so on. And basically, you need, after certain period of time, look back at what you thought, and what you thought last year could have changed drastically and so on. So the issue is you have to have the dynamic regulation, and regulation normally doesn't work like that. Regulation works at discrete kind of steps and so on, lags behind, and the regulatory lag is the big issue with fintech in general. And there have been in literature the idea that there is functional versus sectoral kind of approach to regulation. So who regulates the new fintechs? So is it somebody who deals with all this digitalization, with the technology kind of set, or somebody who deals with the area in which they operate? So if I have a new bank, it will be a digital kind of a regulatory body, or it will be the normal kind of, in the UK case, Financial Services Authority or Financial Conduct Authority. So this is the kind of thing. And the literature is bloody pasted all over with this kind of dichotomous, in my opinion, kind of distinction. In fact, what we kind of have found, even in some of the less academic literature that describes how regulation applies, or in kind of talks with people in industry and so on, that there isn't such a distinction at all. So both of these seem to apply equally and to apply at the same time. On the face of it, take the UK, we have the normal kind of financial authority regulation applying to new financial services kind of institutions, new banks, for example, and so on. So they need to get their normal kind of licenses. They're subject more or less to the same kind of regulation and so on as the normal one. But then if you deep dig, the financial regulator has its own kind of department. You know, Bank of England has on fintech or digitalization and so on, which basically means, although is the general kind of regulator that takes the overall view and so on, there are specialized departments, so the functional kind of differences and so on of what they're supposed to be doing are still taken into account. And then there is the other kind of thing. There is an informal kind of cooperation, and call it alliance and so on. So for fintech kind of a regulation in the UK in particular, there are 11 different regulatory bodies that kind of combine and work together in order to provide this. Now, obviously, you'll say this looks like the benefit system before universal credit, still existing, where there were like 20, 30 different kind of benefits and nobody could have a coordination and so on. But with very kind of fastly evolving industry, this is not feasible. So essentially the approach, in particular in the UK, is you have the sectoral kind of body that does the main part of the regulation and so on, and the control and oversight, but they have their own kind of functional kind of departments, and they coordinate and consult with all the other kind of bodies that could be involved in this. And this kind of coordination is institutionalized in a way, because they kind of regularly meet and consult. So to put it in another way, what the academic literature tells us is not exactly true. It's not true at all, to put it in kind of a different kind of way. And the reason is not true is two main reasons. First of all, we like to simplify things. And by simplifying, saying this versus the other, while the two may overlap to kind of great extent. And the other thing is, when you have any kind of industry that is changing, evolving, and going through different rounds of metamorphosis and so on, the way things work with it change with it. So we do an overview how the regulations work now. If you do it in 2 years' time, we may end up with quite different kind of conclusions. And the final bit of the puzzle with terms of regulation is, in particular for the UK and India, because UK is one of the kind of first innovators in this area, and India had adopted it since, the regulatory sandbox. And this is the important thing. I think it was Alex last night talking about it, and there is quite a lot of confusion in the literature about sandboxes. So there is development sandbox and regulatory sandbox. Very different things, nothing in common between them in certain way. So the regulatory sandbox is designed to overcome the regulation kind of challenge. The issue that the industry is changing, the two-edged sword kind of thing that I mentioned. So essentially, you need to have flexibility, you need to have a dynamic approach, and you need at the same time to be protective, say, in particular of final consumers and so on, simply because these new technologies and so on may present new challenges, may create new kind of opportunities for fraud, to take an example. So essentially, although the regulatory sandbox may look as any other kind of development, other kind of sandboxes, because the participants in the sandbox need to take something out of it. It has been created by the regulator, and the main purpose, among other things and so on, is to kind of mitigate the challenges presented to regulation, to test different ideas, how they affect, say, the protection of customers and so on, and then to decide based on this, does some of these regulations need to be strengthened, or some of these requirements need to be relaxed. So this is the general kind of idea. And then on top of that, you have some, in order to test this kind of idea and so on, some of these participants don't need, in some cases, to fulfill all the kind of requirements that are needed for, say, if they're a new bank or so on, for full banking license and so on, because some of the tests cannot be kind of undertaken in this kind of environment. So this is the whole idea. And regulatory sandbox has been kind of praised in the literature as a unique kind of way in which we address the dynamic regulation kind of problem, which is purely kind of things. But then there are in the literature a lot of so-called controversies, people arguing this against that and so on. And I will argue these don't exist. So first of all, you have always somewhere on the top, disrupting role of financial technologies. Yeah, but some people also mention there is a stabilizing role. So, for example, increasing the level of digitalization of the economy or of financial sector or anything makes it more stable, less prone to crisis. in the banking sector, there are quite a few actually papers saying that the banking kind of stability increases with the level of digitalization or digital inclusions of banking customers and so on. Why is this? Because if you have kind of more digital involvement, more of the things are automated, so it's easier to control them and so on. Now, obviously, always the most stabilizing role on its own can create an additional kind of challenges in order to additional disruption. Think about something that has been around for 20, 30 years at least, the automated trading on organized markets and so on. Automatic trading, where computers can trade billions of pounds and so on. Well, it has been considered early on as a good thing. It increases price discovery, makes market more efficient and so on. But then it can be disruptive because it can create kind of panics and so on. What was the solution? The solution, introduced 20, 30 years ago, to be fair, was so-called circuit breakers, where under certain circumstances, based on certain rules, automatic trading is suspended, only human initiated one remains and so on. So it's very, very similar to the case with any kind of other disruptive technology as the fintechs is and so on. So fintechs generally are considered to be disrupting kind of the industry because they create new opportunities, new challenges and so on, but they also stabilize it, because they rationalized a lot of the operations. But after stabilizing it, it's not the end of the road. It's not like phase 1, phase 2. After they stabilizing that, they go through certain growth, reach certain threshold and so on, in which they can create, without any additional kind of new entrance, new involvement and so on, can create a new disruption and so on. So it's more like a spiral than a two-stage kind of process. But these kind of two things are all very often pitted against each other. So this is the thing. But it is the normal kind of economic process. After all, remember Schumpeter, the creative destruction kind of process, which he claimed is beneficial and so on. So if you take a very short-termist view, the whole process creates a problem. But any kind of economic growth process and so on, any evolution creates problems in short term. In the longer term is more like a fashion. All things come back in fashion all the time and so on. So there have been, in particular, quite interesting paper. It's only one.
Philip, 1 second. I'm a bit conscious of time, so can you,
I will speed it up.
Yeah.
About the issue of sandboxes versus innovation hubs or innovation clusters and so on, where it was French-centric, to be fair. It was claimed the innovation hubs have all the benefits with sandboxes and so on. They are more kind of they're better and so on. But the whole point, if you look at this, is that it misses the point. Maybe if you compare development sandboxes, but innovation hubs, clusters are designed, created to foster innovation, to kind of help the development of fintech. Regulatory sandboxes, what it is told there and so on, are not created for this purpose. Their main purpose is to minimize the disruption, to solve the regulatory lag and so on. So it's the whole point as the issue of kind of the social role of markets. Markets are not designed to maximize welfare and so on. They're designed to maximize profit. So the whole point is kind of very, very misplaced. But one interesting theoretical result is the so-called impossible triangle. It says that if the regulators try to balance three different kind of objectives, stimulate innovation, minimize, provide clear rules, and minimize kind of threats to market stability and so on, they can only achieve two of them at the time, which is quite interesting thing and so on. But on the other side, it basically provides a very good and nice framework of how regulations should work. If you cannot balance all three of them, essentially fix two of them, to some level, adjust the third one, they go again and again by going through the loop. Because after all, the regulation has to be a dynamic process. If you can find the ideal regulation and so on, then we will kill fintech innovation altogether, because fintech innovation changes the things and so on. And then there is the other kind of thing, a lot of thing about the digital economy, about being impersonal, taking out the human touch out of it and so on. But is it really impersonal? There is a lot of evidence from the literature that many of the fintech startups and so on are based on social networks, the same kind of serial entrepreneurs going from one to the other, some of these things failing and so on. Then the success of them also depends on social contacts. So one of the findings, for example, is that I think even in the Indian case was noted in one of previous events that if you have a kind of a single kind of driving force, single person behind, it's much more likely to fail when you have a few of them. If you have several rounds of essentially funding, because then you get more contacts and so on, it kind of makes it more kind of successful. The whole issue with innovation hubs and so on, where you have all these contacts, formally or informally, which increase the rate of success and so on. So if there is a lot of social element into this, and I will now go to the kind of more or less final thing, the issue of how things develop. You have the issue of startups and how they they're funded, because in addition to being told what they can or cannot do, they need the resources to grow. And there is the big issue of valuation, the dot-com boom, if you remember, and so on, because many of these businesses may be based on very uncertain, very speculative in the kind of valuations and so on. And these essentially, there have been a lot of theoretical issues. We'll use contingent real options approach and so on. The problem is, if you know how these things work, you will find more holes than in a strainer in this, because the big idea is great, but when I go into the details, all these things create a lot of issues and problems. But then the issue is that if evaluation is highly uncertain, it becomes at early stages quite speculative kind of thing. And who can fund speculative kind of things? So if you think about the sources of funding, there have been findings that in particular, angel investment, venture capital, and so on, they're not that interested at the very early stages, because it's very highly speculative. At the very early stages, it's much more likely than that they will find funding from family, friends, banks. So essentially, when they reach a critical mass, and the critical mass depends also from the whole economic environments and so on, then actually the whole thing clicks and the venture capital comes into the place. So the whole kind of things basically means that for different places, for different environments and so on, different policies are kind of applicable. And to take an example in our project, we have the UK, where we have a very highly developed system of funding startups in general. We have a lot of tax breaks, tax advantages, and so on. So venture capital has been active here. So for this reason, in the UK, essentially, and so on, is much more liberal kind of system. They can more or less survive on their own. In India, notice new kind of financial fintechs and so on have to use the banking licenses of existing banks. It makes you think, why is this? Why put this restriction and so on? But if you don't have the ready availability of venture capital and so on, the logical thing is what replaces is essentially banking loans, so bank funding. So if you force the new kind of fintechs to pitch their ideas, to get into collaboration with banks and so on, you create linkages, you basically introduce them to each other, and the banking funding, which is the first kind of stage in this kind of long process and so on, becomes available, and then maybe later on they can get into venture capital funding and so on. So it facilitates the whole process. And then there are always the social elements and so on, the social networks and everything else I talked about. I'll drop this now and go to the very last issue. The most thorny and the most difficult thing. We have in our project trade facilitation by fintech. Now, and we have the fintech trade and the foreign direct investment. Now, looking at this, the trade facilitation by fintech is the thing where fintech has the greatest kind of opportunity, the most benefit. And there are plenty of theoretical papers that tell you about how this, for example, this kind of distributed ledger system, blockchain being one of the examples and so on, can be introduced, that they can facilitate trade. They can be, you can create architecture for international payment system, for international logistics systems and so on. Fine, great promise and so on. The problem, nothing exists in practice. Now, things, the building elements are there. If you remember, we had this kind of presentation early on by this guy in India who was providing service integrating for small and medium businesses, integrating their banking payment system with their accounting systems and so on. So essentially, what you can do is very, very similar kind of systems for international trade, because these systems essentially don't need to be fully open and so on. They are just connecting different autonomous systems. So very, very kind of easy. The problem, nothing still exists, not to the best of our knowledge. Now, the two things where we can have made some progress is the issue of fintech trade and foreign direct investment. So we talked about foreign direct investment today, issues and so on, but there is something there. And the issue of fintech trade, we had all these interviews and so on with businesses, and we know how things stand. So essentially, the way it stands, as it's expected, is that in terms of trade with financial services and so on, India is the beast, is providing most of the trade and so on. Most of these services, while in foreign direct investment, it seems to be the other kind of way around, which builds on the relative kind of competitive advantages of the two countries and so on, and the opportunities that exist in this. So this is essentially what we can take from, and I said, not only literature, but some of the impressions that we got from other components of the project. All right, so